We're at 2:01, so we'll kick it off here. So welcome everybody. Today what we're talking about, specifically if you're at a healthcare company and you're managing multiple frameworks, SOC 2, ISO, PCI, HIPAA, the whole alphabet soup of different compliance frameworks. How can you harmonize that program to find some major efficiencies, both in the way that you manage the program internally, but also in the external audit? So we're going to cover off on that. In way of a quick agenda, so you know what to expect today. We're going to give you quick intros. So why the heck are Drew and I qualified to talk about this topic? So we'll talk through that and why we think Drew as the audit firm and Risk360 as a consulting firm are a unique combo to give you guys some perspectives on why we do this. Also, Risk360 has 3 frameworks that we personally get certified against. So not only do we help build the programs, we know what it's like to be audited. We're going to talk about the problem. So make sure that we get real clear on the problem. What are we solving here? Does this reflect your world? If you agree with the problem, then you'll love the playbook. So we're going to run through exactly how to do this. We'll talk about how to get ready to structure a harmonized framework. And then Drew will talk us through from the auditor's perspective, things to ensure a successful consolidated audit. A lot of questions come up with GRC tooling. So we're going to answer those, dispel some of the facts and the myths, and try to give you guys some clarity if you're thinking about a GRC tool. We'll do some Q&A, and then I'll give you guys 2 real world examples. So if you don't want to hear from Drew and myself, we have some videos where companies who did this themselves and followed this exact playbook will talk about what they did and the pitfalls and things that they tried to avoid as they did this internally. So we'll give you those links so you have that. So in way of quick intros, Drew, he's a shareholder over at LBMC. I think we've known each other for about 10 years. Drew played a huge role in Risk360's early days, because when we first started Risk360 about a decade ago, LBMC and Risk360 partnered on some projects, and we were working directly with Drew back in those early days. So important part of our history. Drew and team up in Nashville, LBMC, although y'all serve clients nationally, has built a really strong IT assurance practice, really strong IT audit practice, and I think an excellent healthcare niche right there in Nashville. So in my opinion, just very qualified to talk about this topic, is qualified to do multiple types of audits. So is a great partner in the audit space. And then myself, Christian, hi, I'm the CEO and co-founder of Risk360. And I'll tell you a little bit about our firm in just a second. But Drew, I do want to give you a second just to talk about LBMC and give us a quick overview of who you guys are.
Yeah, Christian, thanks for the introduction. Glad to be here today. Thanks for having me. So LBMC was founded in 1984, so it's actually our 40th anniversary this year. It was started as a traditional accounting and tax firm, and as they continued to grow, our founders were very entrepreneurial. Mid-sized businesses would come and say, "Hey, do you all do this?" And they'd say, "Well, we'll either figure it out or hire the right person that can." And so now we have a huge advisory practice, as well as all of our affiliate firms, everything from staffing solutions to investment advisors to, like I said, audit, tax, and then of course there's our cybersecurity group. It's a top 40 accounting firm, primarily based in Tennessee. We have a Louisville office and a Charlotte office as well. Our cybersecurity team, we've got over 70 dedicated security professionals. And I put them in 3 buckets. I put them in that assurance bucket that you mentioned, Christian, which is kind of where I grew up. So that's where our SOC reporting and PCI and HITRUST, our ISO work all comes out of that. Our technical security team, which is primarily like our purple teaming and penetration testing, incident response, and then our consulting team, which you can kind of describe as a catch-all, but they do a lot of outsourced and co-sourced security leadership, cloud assessments, risk assessments, and basically qualified to do anything that you might need from either a security standpoint or get your audit or assessment done.
Yep. Awesome. Yeah. And so, Drew, the reason I invited you here and for everybody else's context is because in the world of IT assurance, there's kind of a 3-party system. There's often an advisory firm like Risk360 who's helping build the program. There's the firm being audited, and then there's the audit firm itself. And my belief is to pull off this multi-framework strategy to really get the full benefits of harmonizing the framework and consolidating the audits. All 3 of those parties have to work closely together. So while I can talk about this all day long, it's great to have someone on your side of the table agreeing and thinking through these strategies themselves. And that's kind of where Risk360 comes in. So what Risk360 does is our specialty is to have multiple works, multiple business units, multiple products, complexity, you're probably firm, attacking on SOC reports, and that results in thousands of hours of audit effort, a really difficult program to manage. We want to bring all that together. We have a whole team that is experts across multiple frameworks. We have playbooks to implement this multi-framework strategy. And one thing I'm really proud of is we've built a GRC platform of our own that handles the nuances of companies who want to manage a program in this way. That's specifically built for this thing. We've thought a lot about that. So that is us over here at Risk 360. So I want to dive into the challenge. So the reason I want to start here is because I hope that everyone watching this is nodding their head. This really sounds like you. I want you to know that we get it and that we're nailing the pain points and it's resonating with you. So what I'm seeing out there as we're working with our different customers who are going through this problem is right now we're in a weird environment, or not a weird environment, just I would say amplified environment where through contracts and through regulations, there is just a huge amount of compliance. Every customer that we work with has very significant contracts coming out where there's different security and privacy clauses that are mandating these different compliance frameworks. We're seeing things like come out of the EU, like the EU AI Act, DORA, NIS2, GDPR, of course. There's an abundance of different frameworks depending on your industry vertical here in the US, like SOC 2, HITRUST, HIPAA, whole alphabet soup. So not only are you building these programs for good risk management, for good cybersecurity hygiene, there's actually revenue on the line. You have to protect the revenue. You have to protect the business in terms of litigation and the regulatory side. So compliance and security has become just mission critical for the organization. And as you accumulate these different requirements, ultimately what your team is doing is managing thousands of controls. And if you have 1,000 controls, you probably have several thousand pieces of audit evidence that you have to produce to get through an audit. And then in combination with that, what we're seeing in the environment is that teams are very lean. Due to the economic conditions, just due to the cost structure of organizations, you do not have bloated teams. I haven't talked to any security leader who thinks they have a team that is big enough. So you're trying to manage more and more compliance, more and more regulatory issues, more cybersecurity threats with a leaner and leaner team. So you have to figure out a way to do all this efficiently. And this is especially relevant to healthcare organizations because your data is targeted by cyber criminals and you have a very heavy regulatory environment. So you're talking about something that's the intersection of mission critical for the business, lean team, and a lot of work that can be very, tiring for the team and can hurt the team ultimately. So as we kind of evaluated opportunities, we said, hey, look, harmonizing these frameworks are a really good business opportunity for you to not only cut costs and become more efficient, but also to get better at the same time. And there are very few opportunities in business to do both of those at once. And we think this is one. So most of the folks I'm talking to, they want to build a scalable program that can intake new regulatory requirements, new compliance requirements. They want to be efficient while doing that. They also want to live in a world where they're not just building a compliance check the box, they're supporting the risk management and the cybersecurity strategy as well. And they want to harmonize that program ultimately across different business units, across different frameworks. They want to consolidate the audit. They want to manage risk more than they want to focus on just getting through another audit. So if that sounds like you're in the right place. That's exactly what teams like Drew and teams like us over at Risk 360 are trying to do. If that doesn't sound like you could probably go ahead and hop off the webinar. This isn't for you, but if this sounds like you're definitely in the right place. So two things I want to start off by covering is one is like, how do you get ready for a harmonized audit? So Drew and I can talk through that. I think there's 4 things to consider when we're talking about readiness, and then we'll hop into the audit itself from Drew's perspective. How do you get ready to that? So when it comes to a harmonized audit, I want to break this up into four buckets because after doing hundreds of these, this is kind of the pattern I'm seeing across the board. I think you have to have a shared vision with your team, which most people do not start there. That's the step that they skip. So I'll talk about why that's so important and how I've seen that drive organizational change. Then doing some type of current state assessment and a strategy roadmap to implement, harmonizing the framework itself, and then implementing the elements it takes to harmonize a framework organizationally. So I'll walk you through each of these. Number one is the shared vision. Drew, I don't know if you've seen this, but when we talk to clients, it's funny when we'll get a call, someone will call Risk 360. It'll be a big healthcare company. It'll be the head of GRC. and they don't really know what to tell us. They just know it hurts. They say, I'm doing all this stuff. GRC is painful. There has to be a better way. But what I've realized is sometimes there'll be 5 or 6, 10 people on a call, and they're all trying to figure out the problem with me. So one
Yeah.
thing that we did early on was we followed this 3-step process where first we define the problem, get everybody to agree on the problem, then we define the future state, even though that future state might be far out. And what we've noticed is if we can get everyone on the same page about the problem and the future state, well, then naturally we can figure out how to close that gap, right? The 3-step process to close the gap. So that probably sounds really intuitive, and like you're like, no, duh, of course everyone has to be on the same page. But what we've uncovered through that process is that when it comes to a multi-framework program, not everyone agrees on the problem statement. You'll have one team that's worried about vulnerability management, one team that's worried about internal audits, one team that's worried about risk management, one team that's actually managing the audit itself. And everyone wants to focus on their own priority area. So to get everyone rallied around, what are we trying to actually accomplish here? How do we harmonize the framework? What is the real trying to do? So equally importantly, what is the future state we're trying to accomplish? It's like a really key, we call it the bond of joint discovery. That's what our chief revenue officer calls it, the bond of joint discovery. But if you can do that with the team, it's really, really powerful. And that is almost always the step that is missed. Drew, do you see anything like that
I love that you pointed out, Christian. Sometimes maybe it's one call and we're figuring out the problem with them. Maybe sometimes it's we talk to head of compliance or head of security, and they kind of they give us one version, and then we have another call with somebody on their team, and it sounds completely different. And sometimes they define the problem. They don't even think about the problem. They just say, hey, we've been told we got to get a SOC 2. And then this other big customer said we need HITRUST. And it's almost like they're just starting at the end. They're not thinking about a secure mindset. They're not thinking about anything other than we just got to make this customer happy. There's a reason the customer has asked for these things, because they want you to be demonstrating not just compliance, or that you have a piece of paper that says I've got HITRUST or I've got a SOC 2 report. They want to know that you're going to be treating their data respectfully and confidentially, and really trying to do a really good job securing that data. So I love that you start with this, because it's very rare that when we're taking our first call that we're starting with something like that.
Yeah, I mean, there's like so much business case attached to it. Like one thing I hear often is a client will list 7 different frameworks, and I'm like, hold on a second, why are you doing all those frameworks? Like, are you sure you need to be doing all of those? And they'll go find out that there was a client 10 years ago that required them to do this, but that client's not even a client anymore. And there's there's a lot of business discussion that needs to happen to really figure out which framework should you do, why should you do them. And then if you're an organization that has multiple products, you might have, let's say you have 5 different products. Well, maybe one product requires SOC 2 and ISO, another product requires HITRUST because it serves the healthcare industry. You have to think about that too. So there's a lot of nuance to handle, and just getting everyone on the same page about what that looks like. There's a ton of power in that. And the reason I'm in on this for so long is that what I've seen when it comes to actually finding the efficiency and pulling the strategy off, the difference between success and failure is that first step of clarity. If you can get the whole team on the same page, crystal clear about the business objectives, crystal clear about the future outcome, organizational change follows really, really easy. And anytime I've ever seen this fail, the root cause always tends to come back to that first step of just getting a shared vision. And us as security leaders or GRC leaders, we're in the weeds. We're thinking about mapping a control or a security control, whatever it might be. We might miss the forest because we're so in the weeds. So just think about that shared vision piece. I think I've beat that up enough. Next step after you do that, once you have that shared vision, what I've seen is, like I said, we tend to agree. Once we get past that stage, here's the problem. Everybody is nodding their head. Yeah, very clear problem. And then we talk about that beautiful future state where everything's harmonized and we have so much efficiency. People tend to agree with that. But there's obviously a gap between where you are and where you need to be. And that roadmap is complex and different for every organization and unclear. So what we often do is doing a current state assessment and developing a strategy roadmap for that. And the power in that is that it creates that checklist of everything the organization needs to do to bridge that gap. And more importantly, it focuses the organization's energy. So rather than operating in pockets or sometimes people even working against each other, you have a very clear task list that you can create a project around to implement that strategy. So think common things are stuff like maybe your governance structure needs to be updated. For example, often we'll see that governance lives in pockets. It lives at the product teams. So there's no central group that can actually govern the harmonized strategy. So you have to form that. Maybe the same thing happens with policies. Maybe policies live in pockets because you've acquired a company. They kept their policies that are different from another pocket of company area. Maybe there's different tools. So identity and access management is managed one way over here and a different way over there. So what are all those things that you need to do? And make that list and then ultimately prioritize that list, create a great project plan out of it, get buy-in from the organization to execute against it. And then you can start chopping away at that strategy roadmap to really receive the benefits of that harmony. But without that first step, understanding your problem, getting everyone to agree, agreeing on a future state and getting excited about it, this is that middle part, that gap closure. But without that, it's really hard to harness the energy of the whole team. Drew, I don't know if there's anything you want to add to that step and what you're seeing.
Yeah, I think it's just, especially if you've been doing it for a while, it's really easy to get on autopilot. Like, okay, well, we've been doing these 3 or 4 different frameworks and certifications for a little while. And yes, it's a pain every year, and we work with 3 or 4 different firms, but it works and it's fine. And you get on that autopilot and you're not really thinking about doing something like this. So even if, it feels like recurring work that you've got on autopilot, take a step back and look at some of the things that you just pointed out, and a lot of those problems would surface, and then you're going to make it easier on your entire team at the end of the day.
Yeah, important. I think the only reason Risk 360 gets pulled in sometimes is to be the outside party. And what I mean by that is sometimes we reveal net new things. We definitely help with clarity and help like get everybody on the same page. That always happens. But I don't think anyone's ever really, really surprised about what we find.
Mhm.
You know, if I tell people governance is a problem, the leader is typically aware of that. So the power that an outside party like Risk 360 brings is let's get that on paper. Let's get everyone to agree on it. Let's come up with a strategy of what we're going to do about it. And there's something about that outside party adding the energy to the equation where they can get everybody on the same page and motivated to do it. So that's really exciting thing that we do. So again, first step, shared vision, get everybody on the same page. Second steps, that current state assessment, that strategy roadmap. You can bring an outside party in, try to do it yourself either way, but you have to get that plan on paper. You have to create the budget around it. And then I'll say the third step is harmonizing the framework, which is inclination is to begin here. Like, I don't know, Drew, how many mappings that you've seen, how many Excel mappings of frameworks. You can Google it right now, and there'll be no less than 50 of them out there, right?
Mhm.
But what I found is like that's the easy part. It really is not the cure isn't the harmonized mapped framework. That just isn't what is going to do it because I can map frameworks all day long. It's things like managing the nuances. Like maybe you're using 5 different audit firms for 5 different audit reports. Well, who has the authority to consolidate that? Maybe you have 4 SOC reports with different control languages. Well, who's going to harmonize that control language? Maybe you're doing 3 frameworks that you don't even have to do that you didn't realize that. Well, who's going to pull all that together and realize it? So there's a lot of prep work that needs to go in, but once you do that discovery and you agree on the basis, then you can build the harmonized control framework and take into consideration the nuances of control mapping, the evidence that meets those controls, scope of each audit report, the nuances of audit periods, things like that. Drew, what are you seeing when it comes to like customers bringing you their mapped framework and trying to audit against it?
Yeah, a really common misunderstanding is, hey, we've done this mapping and everything maps 1-to-1, and so you really ought, I appreciate the audit once report mini mantra and the harmonization of these frameworks, but it is pretty rare that we can audit one requirement and it truly apply to everything that they need to cover, whether it be HIPAA, SOC, PCI, and ISO 27001 assessment. It's just the requirements do differ in places. So there's going to be some where that's going to work beautifully. But the points that you brought out around the timing of those, the tools involved with those, what processes and policies are really governing those, might play a role in that. And the requirements sometimes don't even agree with each other. So sometimes there's more nuance to some, and you need additional evidence for one, and maybe it's just kind of observing it in another. So those are really important to understand, but it's really common for us to hear, hey, we've done this mapping. We'll be able to just give you this one thing one time. And as good as that sounds, and as easy as I want that to be,
Yeah.
there's usually a little bit more to it than that.
Yeah. What I found too, there's also a nuance between internally managing the controls and then externally auditing against them. And I'll give you an example. Let's say internally you're doing a user access review. Well, it's one process to remember to do that user access review, to have a template for how you're going to do it, to understand all the systems that you have to do the access review. So that's a tool set that you need. And that's something like, for example, we built Full Circle to support. And then it's a totally different capability to be able to produce the timely evidence that you did all that to an external auditor in a way that the external auditor can accept. And so one of the things I'm really proud about Full Circle is that we've kind of tried to accommodate both of those. And most tools, certainly Excel spreadsheets, don't accommodate the operations piece of it as well as working with the external auditor. So I think that mapping between the controls, but also down to the evidence piece, is a piece that a lot of people don't think about when they think about harmonizing the control framework.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So to recap, we're agreeing on a shared vision. We've done the current state assessment and the strategic roadmap. We're feeling great. We've harmonized our framework. We've used the 80-20 rule. I always throw out there, don't worry about the nuanced stuff because the effort might not be there, but at least get the big stuff, map that. And we have our harmonized framework. And then the last piece I think is key to these programs is to implement and operationalize your program. So what I have seen, and the reason that I include this as a step, is sometimes it's easy to get a lot of energy around getting this kind of project off the ground. Everyone's really excited about it. A whole surge of energy has happened, and everyone's agreeing and looking forward to the world of that mapped, harmonized framework with less audit work and less controls to manage. So year one, you have a ton of energy, but then you have to somehow maintain that in years 2, 3, 4, and beyond. So some of the things I start thinking about is, well, how are you going to keep doing your information risk council meetings, because that's your governance structure. Like, how do you keep those interesting? How do you keep the organization motivated? The next acquisition, how do you onboard that into the overall strategy that you have so it doesn't devolve back into what you had before? Do you have shared services versus a decentralized services? So maybe you don't even have a shared security team, or maybe you do, but you have to onboard new products into that. So just a lot of stuff to think about. But I think if you have done a really good current state assessment and a strategic roadmap, you have a good beat on what those things are, and you can apply energy to them year over year to maintain them. Again, I emphasize this because we have customers that we've worked with for 7, 8 years now, and you get to the back half of those years, 5 years, 5, 6, 7, and your team has turnover. Maybe you built the program in Excel spreadsheets and Word documents, and the next person didn't know where those documents were, didn't understand the strategy, so the program just kind of degrades. So really think about implementing those new elements and how to operationalize it. I think that's where a GRC platform can really be helpful, and definitely some good documentation. So we'll talk about that in the third section here, where GRC tools come in. But just to recap, I think that is the process. This is the exact roadmap that we take our clients through: shared vision, current state assessment with that maturity roadmap, mapping and creating the harmony framework, implementing all the new elements that we identified in that gap assessment, and then ultimately getting them hopefully into a GRC tool if they're ready for that, which we'll talk about next. So Drew, that's kind of our implementation strategy. And theoretically, what happens is we've done the hard work of doing this. We've taken a year to harmonize the framework. We have things ready to go. We're bundling up all the evidence. We're engaging with a company like LBMC to get ready to be that test once, report many auditor, and to agree on the strategy, bring you guys along for the ride. And you've identified some cool points I think is really important in terms of how to make sure that external audit consolidation works out. Can you talk through those?
Yeah, absolutely. And I wish every company that comes to us with an audit need had already worked with you all, because sometimes they don't and they try to start directly at the audit. In which case, we need to kind of go back to the start and say, hey, as much as I would love to get you a SOC 2 report by the end of this year, there's probably some things that we need to talk about. So that is absolutely the perfect scenario, which I wish we saw more of. So I kind of included 3 things that we see as common challenges when you're thinking about trying to actually go through these assessments together. One is timing. It really is everything. There's a lot of different things that come to play when it comes into timing. And then on top of that, scope. Is it really the same across each one of those? With PCI, you often see network segmentation, and the scope for that is very limited compared to what you might see with any of these other frameworks. So it can get a little bit trickier in that. So I want to talk about that. And then also just who's performing the audit. What are your goals with that? And is your auditor truly qualified to be performing each one of these types of accreditations for you? So first, on timing, each one of these can have different nuances to it. I gave a few examples here on this slide. When you're going through a HITRUST assessment, specifically like an R2 validated assessment, and HITRUST has a lot of different types of assessments, and E1 is kind of your baseline entry point to HITRUST, then an I1, and then an R2. It's just kind of like that's the big one. You go through that every other year, and it's going to be really customized to your organization. But when you're going through one of those, there's a rule that you're performing and giving evidence to your assessor with around a 3-month period for that audit cycle. So you think about that, and if your HITRUST certification date is in January, but you truly do also need a SOC 2 report, and the end of your SOC 2 report is the end of September, well, that's a problem, because if we have to abide by the 90-day rule for HITRUST, and typically when we're coming in and doing a SOC report, you're either doing like a continuous audit, or you're coming in closer to the end of the reporting period, issuing a report 30 to 60 days after that report period end. Those do not line up. And sometimes companies that are going through this with multiple frameworks, it was really just based on when a big customer told them they had to do it. And as soon as they could get the report out, that's when the date fell. So if they would just have a conversation with their customer and say, hey, I know we've historically done this HITRUST assessment in January. We are looking to harmonize all of the frameworks that we're currently complying with, and we're either going to push that back or move your SOC report up. Usually one of those customers is going to be okay with that change. Maybe you have to go through a little bit more pain in the short period and get a shorter report period for your SOC report or something like that. But there's ways to work through that and get those dates as close to each other as you can. They don't have to be the exact same, and you can work with your audit organization on what they can do around how close they can be. But that's definitely one consideration. Another one is certain frameworks or certifications are not going to necessarily, the rules are just different. So one thing that we encounter with our authoritative body for ISO, which is called the ANAB, they will not allow you to rely on other audits. So when you think about that, well, if I do my SOC report or my HITRUST or my PCI work first, they're not going to allow me to leverage all that same evidence for that work. They perform witness audits, and the rules are just a little bit different. So the SOC auditor or the HITRUST auditor can sit in on ISO interviews. And you can, if you approach it the right way, utilize the same evidence if ISO kind of comes first in that domino. So you really have to think about what are the actual accreditation rules that your assessor body has to follow to be able to rely on that work.
One thing I see, Drew, is, I mean, you just have I say you just have 4 frameworks, but there's 24 frameworks out there, and every single framework comes with some little nuance that, unless you're an industry insider and you're an expert on that framework, you don't understand the context or why that's the case. You mentioned some good examples like HITRUST having that 90-day rule, ISO having an ISMS, NIST having system security plans, PCI having very narrow scopes and segmentation strategies. So, and rarely do I work with a team who has all of that expertise in-house already. So like they're good security experts, good GRC experts. They get the principles, but they may not understand all the nuances of the different frameworks. That's why you and I have built whole teams. Like there's people who they only do one framework their entire
Yeah.
career. Like if
Yeah.
you're looking at FedRAMP or PCI or some of those, like they just become experts in just that framework. And we can bring all that to the table, create a project plan that accommodates all of that nuance and that you can actually execute against. That is almost impossible to do unless you have subject matter experts against every framework and knows how to handle that nuance. And if you don't do that, what you're going to do is do a whole lot of work, get to the external audit, and then just have everything kicked back because your evidence is the wrong timing, the scope is wrong, it's a system that's not in scope. And that's very, very frustrating to go through all that work and then not have it pay off at the end.
Yeah, and if you're dealing with healthcare data, you think about HIPAA, there's no certification for HIPAA, but it's something you're mandated and should be doing internally or working with a consultant. And that just adds another layer of complexity to these problems.
Yep.
So then we look at scope. Maybe your scope is the same. We've talked some about some of these issues, policy and process harmonization. Maybe they're different. Maybe different groups are owning them. That control consistency, you've got different reports and the control language is completely different. Maybe you've got mapping, but like I said, those different nuances really come into play there. One thing I didn't put on the slide, but in this business, we see a lot of companies that go through a ton of M&A activity. We see a lot of companies that are getting picked up by private equity. So whether they've just been acquired or whether they are the acquirer, there's often issues with, okay, hey, we just bought this company. We need to roll them into our HITRUST assessment. We need to roll them into our SOC report. How do we do that? And if you don't really step back, define what that roadmap's going to look like in the short term, how are you going to address those challenges? And in the long term, how are you really going to harmonize those across the platform? That could be a real issue. Do they need to maintain an independent SOC report, or can you truly consolidate it into your existing SOC report?
Yeah.
We are having those conversations almost weekly at this point. It's pretty crazy how often you see that. If a PE firm comes in, then maybe they want to completely change some of your policies and procedures and how you're operating on that, or maybe you're what may already feel lean feels even leaner after you go through that acquisition and have to think about, okay, how do I manage my team a little bit differently
Yep.
now that that's told differently. So
Drew, one of the things like I don't want anyone to feel discouraged because we're talking about all these nuances and the complicated nature of this, and it is complicated, but it's one of those things. I think it's simple but not easy. And an example that comes to mind is we went to New York last week as a family, and we went to Lego in New York. And my son, who's 7, is for some reason really good at putting together Lego stuff. So we got him like this huge Lego set, and he dumps it all in the bed, and I'm like, dude, you're never gonna be able to put that together. Like I can't even envision how this is gonna become a thing. But the key is if you have the instruction manual, it's pretty simple. It's simple if you have the instructions. And I feel like this is like the world we live in. We are the instruction manual. Because for me, when I look at this, it's so clear. Like I can see where all the puzzle pieces fit together, exactly how to do this. Okay, easy. I can do this. But if you don't have that instruction manual, I don't even know how you begin. So just for anyone who's looking for some encouragement and they're like, man, is it even worth it for me to go through this? Like it's not broken today. Sure. I mean, we saved one client 1.6 million, but I get it. It's like, I don't even know if I should go through this. And I
yeah.
think my encouragement is, hey, look, if you have the instruction manual, it really is pretty easy or simple, at least.
Yeah,
Maybe
yeah.
not easy.
I think that goes to your earlier point too, Christian, on, maybe you really don't need all of the things that you're currently doing. And, as the auditor who gets, I'm gonna get paid more if I'm doing multiple assessments as opposed to one. I'll be the first to challenge my customers on, hey, I know you're telling me you need these 3 SOC reports and you need PCI and you need HITRUST, but do you really need it all if you're doing HITRUST? Could you, and the scope includes each one of those systems in your SOC reports? Could you just do that? Have you ever asked?
Yeah.
And sometimes it's no. That's a good point. And that can really help simplify it as well. And sometimes that answer is no. Sometimes it is what it is, and
Yep.
You
There,
have to
there was
go
one
through it
time
all.
recently, Drew, where we went through this really long like solution architecture project with a customer just during the sales cycle for us. We actually didn't even end up working with them because we realized they didn't need us. But just through the scoping process, they cut out two SOC reports because it was like some nuance where they had bought a company, did the SOC report, but then divested of the company, but kept doing the SOC report for whatever reason. And they had two SOC reports. So just through scoping, we were like, why are you doing these two? And they were like, I have no idea. So they stopped doing the SOC 2 reports. And I think they saved like $150,000. So I
Yeah.
always joke with them. I'm like, hey, that is the most value I've ever saved anyone just
Yeah.
through a scoping exercise and helping you undo that. But that's really, really common and a great point.
Yeah. Yeah. And then the last one is just making sure you're choosing a really great partner, right? I mean, I don't want it to be self-serving because there's a lot of great audit firms out there, but they are not all created equal. And so I've just included a few bullets for everybody to think through when they're choosing an audit or an assessor firm to work with, especially if you really do need to go through several different types of audits or assessments against different frameworks. The firm's experience within each framework is really critical. If they're brand new at one thing and maybe they've got 10 years of experience in the other, and you trust them and you've worked with them before, maybe that's a good fit. But if you're trying to find a brand new firm to work with and they've only got that 1 year experience of that other framework, it might not be the best fit, at least on the front end.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
Other firms just don't have the credentials to perform the work, at least not on the audit side. They might have a really good team that can come in and perform internal work, do that consulting, and help you prepare. But make sure you know that difference before you kind of go in for the actual assessment. Make sure you understand their relationships. There's other firms that they can't do a SOC 2 report because they're not a CPA firm, but maybe they have a partnership with a different firm. That doesn't mean that they're bad at it. Maybe they've had that partnership for 15 years. But I think asking that type of question really make sure that you understand what you're going to get at the end of that assessment and not have any surprises. The other is some firms contract a lot of this expertise out. And again, that's not necessarily a bad thing. You have individuals that have 20, 30 years of experience, and they're going to come in and do a great job for you. And if they're a contractor and they've been doing that with that firm for 10 years, well, that's probably low risk, right? But if they don't have that in-house expertise, with their own full-time employees and they contract it out, just make sure you understand that risk and that turnover might look a little bit different. One of the most common complaints we get is, yeah, we worked with this firm for 5 years and we worked with a completely different audit team every year that we went through that. Well, that's incredibly frustrating because you normally want your auditor to have familiarity with your company, with your processes, with your control environment. There's something to getting a new set of eyes on your frameworks and your controls as well. I'm not opposed to that, but oftentimes, at least at an executive level, people really want some consistency. The depth of subject matter expertise is another one that I included there. And I included both the framework and technically. This is one of the, I spent the first 9 years of my career at the Big Four firm, and I really appreciate my time there. I learned a lot. I learned a lot about how to audit. I learned a lot about frameworks, but I didn't get nearly as much technical acumen or nearly as much subject matter expertise on just kind of general cybersecurity until I started to work for more of a niche group like LBMC that focused on that. I knew how to audit, but when I sat down with a network engineer, I had no idea how to, connect with them and talk to them, and they could talk way over my head and just confuse me. We've done a lot of work to train our team not only on the frameworks, but hire people who have actually sat on the industry side that have that technical acumen, who have done what they have done. And so they're going to be a little bit more technically sound and able to relate to those individuals that they're auditing, as opposed to just trying to say, read the control and then look up and say, okay, how do you meet that? They're going to understand more of the challenges.
Yep.
The other dedicated versus part-time resources. This is more common on the accounting firm side, where they want to dabble in security, or they want to be able to dabble in, issue SOC 2 reports, and they're technically qualified to do it, but they don't have true in-house cyber experts. Similarly, of a note, you could run into problems there and maybe get a bad audit. And then how does the firm manage their own teams, right? So for instance, we have a dedicated PCI team. We have a dedicated SOC 2 team. We have a dedicated HITRUST team. We like that because we think we get really in-depth subject matter expertise within each one of those. Other firms do all of that with one team. And you can do that, but you want to feel really comfortable that that team feels really comfortable with every single one of those types of assessments. So I'm not saying it's one way versus the other. I think you can do it either way. But I think it's important to understand how are they going to manage that. And if they do have separate teams, which is what my team has, how are they making sure that they're working together? So, okay, I understand, in the background, you've got different team members working on each one of those, but how are you making it easier on me as the customer when you're performing the actual assessment? Because that can be consolidated and absolutely should. We don't want to be wasting your time. You've got a day job, and it's probably not going through audits.
Drew, sometimes as we're helping organizations implement these kind of programs, they usually have an existing audit firm, and if the partnership is healthy, that's great. But maybe they want our recommendations on firms to choose. And two questions that always come up is, one is like, when should we bring the external audit firm into the picture? Because the tendency is like, all right, let's do all this and bring them in at the very end and let them do the audit. So number one is, I recommend bringing auditor in way earlier in the process. I want to explain to them our thinking, what we're trying to pull off, our thinking on the harmonized strategy, get their blessing on what we're doing and what we're not doing. Because to me, the closer that partnership is, they can help us avoid pitfalls like the scoping stuff that you mentioned, or, hey, I'm not going to accept this evidence, I will accept this. And that's just really, really helpful. That way I know at the end, do I need a month of effort or 3 months of effort to get through this audit? So that's very helpful. I also love the thing that you said about how is the team going to manage that? Because I've worked with external audit firms, across works, and it was basically like working with three different firms. Like we have one client that used one of the big four firms, and it was different partners in different parts of the country. So even though it was the same audit firm, it could have been any three audit firms. They didn't talk, they didn't know each other. It was totally separate.
Yep.
And I've worked with other teams that, from my perspective, I was working with one project manager, getting one report. They had just maybe executing in the background, but for me, it felt very similar. And there was one person I could collaborate with. And you don't even know to ask that question often if you've never been through this, but you really need to think through those logistics, like how's that going to work? So that's a great point.
Yeah. Yeah.
So bonus.
Yeah, so I am seeing this more and more and more from more firms, which I love, is kind of getting away from that checkbox mentality, because it's something I feel like we've been preaching for a very long time. And I love to see more companies out there talking about quality behind the audit. But if your goal is to just have checkbox compliance, I want to pay $5,000. That includes this tool, and it comes with a pre-built set of policies and procedures, and now I got a SOC 2. Okay, that's fine, but at the end of the day, you're not helping yourself. You're not really building a mature cybersecurity risk management program. If you want to do that and meet your compliance needs, but also actually help protect your company and your company's data and grow your security posture, then you probably want to find a firm that has all the things that we talked about on the earlier slide. And it's going to probably not be the cheapest option. It doesn't have to be the most expensive option, but it really does go back to you get what you pay for sometimes.
So I think quality is a great point. Sorry, y'all, for dropping. So I want to hop in just real quick and cover this quick. Like, where is this always comes up in the world of multi-frame, really everywhere now. Like if you're getting one SOC report or ISO or something, everybody's talking about GRC tools. It especially comes up with our clients who are trying to manage multiple frameworks, because the idea is a GRC tool can solve all these problems. So because we have a GRC tool and because we've helped so many organizations with this multi-framework thing, I kind of wanted to anti-sell GRC tools a little bit and get people in the right for how to think about this problem and is it really going to add value. And I'm saying three common trends. One is I want to be real clear about when you shouldn't adopt a GRC platform. I think there's some circumstances or some places in your journey where you just shouldn't adopt one. You're not going to get a lot of value out of it, or your mindset's not in the right place. I want to cover the audit automation piece of it. Love to hear what you're saying, Drew, about the easy button people can connect to tool and achieve compliance, and then talk specifically about like some of the things to think about with harmonized frameworks. So, the one thing about the should you get a GRC tool in the first place? And a lot of the customers that I work with, even at large enterprise companies, they've seen the ads, they're Googling it, and it says, hey, you can get SOC 2, you can get ISO with a click of a button. Or they have a dream in their head where you can connect the GRC platform to all of your tools with a click of a button, and it'll pull in all the audit evidence and just make it really, really easy. And I've seen companies try that. And the biggest trend I have seen is companies trying, not adopting the tool, or the tool is under adopted or just goes stale and no one uses it at all. And the reason that I think that is because there's not the appropriate prep work that goes into it. So everything that I talked about in readiness, I think you should do in tandem or before you adopt a GRC tool, because it adds so much clarity to your requirements. Most of the companies that I work with, they do not have a very clear list of the specific requirements for their GRC tool. They just think that they need one. So it's all about that shared vision, is defining in writing what your success criteria, what are you actually trying to accomplish with that GRC tool? And then how are you going to implement it? And that means implement it both technically, but also when it comes to organizational change, training your team, getting people to adopt it. Excel is the number one competitor to any GRC tool. And it is really hard to get a user to drop Excel and adopt a platform that they have never used before. So you're going to have to go through a lot of internal effort to do that. And if you will do those things, you will have amazing results. I've seen companies change their entire GRC program and save a ton of money and improve their culture through adopting a platform if they go through it the right way. But I just, especially if you're enterprise, if you have any complexity, do not live in a world where you think the tool is the end all be all, the easy button for you. It is not going to work. It won't meet your expectations. It'll get abandoned. Your team will under adopt it, or you'll realize that to make it work, you have to spend $1 million to customize the thing, and that was not in the budget. I was asking, how many of your customers, or do any of your customers, are you dealing with the idea that it can be automated away, and they're trying to give you that evidence? How is that impacting you guys?
Yeah, no, absolutely. We have conversations sometimes on the front end where they have that expectation, or after the fact, if they think about, oh, hey, we got approached by one of these tool sets that said that they can promise all of these. And listen, there are good tools that are out there, but it goes back to what you said. And what I tell them every time is it really depends on the implementation of that tool, because there are some efficiencies that it can give you, and there are going to be efficiencies that, maybe it will be able to integrate into some of your tools, but you got to implement it right. And yeah, we'll get some evidence that way. And yeah, if you actually use it, and we can pop in and you've pre-populated some evidence and somebody's made sure it was there and you've actually filled it out, it can make the interview process and the evidence collection process go easier. But 9 times out of 10, the company, I've already lost them, right? They just like,
Yeah.
oh, well, I just wanted to buy this product, implement it, just turn it on and it would all work. And it doesn't work that way.
Yeah, I see it all the time with some of our enterprise customers where they think they're going to be able to hook it up to Active Directory or hook it up to AWS and it's just going to sync everything down, but they don't realize the amount of customization they've done on their end. So to make those two systems talk to each other, there's got to be some work. There's got to be some requirements gathering. It's going to be some effort. And I always come back to that 80/20 rule. I'm like, there's probably like 5 tools that you use that would represent the most amount of the value that it's going to add. And so maybe focusing in on those and having some strategy around that. But bottom line, it's not an easy button. And then the last thing I just want to mention, we've talked a lot about this. I have not seen another GRC platform that handles across different frameworks, the audits, that kind of thing. And we've really gone through great lengths to handle a lot of that in full circle. And I think it's very frustrating when you adopt a GRC platform. You have all of your controls, you think things are mapped, but then it doesn't accommodate the nuances of evidence and the auditor's not accepting that. So if you're looking to solve this particular problem, during the demo with any GRC platform, like I would highly recommend, like, show me how you're doing that. Show me how you're managing different audit periods, and ask those really hard questions. Because if you operate off the assumption that everything's already mapped, all the audit periods are the same, the scope is the exact same, that likely does not reflect your reality. And the reality is they probably can't demo that because the platform doesn't handle that. So just vet that as you're going through a GRC platform. And if you find one that does, great. Otherwise, you might have to revisit how you're going to actually get the results that you want. All right. So we have about 5 minutes left. Want to take some questions. Andy, jump in. I have some prepared questions for us while people are dropping those in. But if anyone has some Q&A questions, please feel free to drop those in. We did have people submit some in advance of the webinar too, so we'll put those up. This is a good one through. Question number one is, do you have any advice on when and how someone should push back when adopting a new framework? You either have a customer coming in making a new requirement, or an executive thinks a new framework is good, or something like that. How are you thinking about pushing back?
Yeah, it surprises me how many times it happens where, a salesperson just says, "Oh yeah, we can absolutely do that for you," and then procurement on the other end says, "Okay, it's in the contract, here you go." And sometimes it's really just asking, like,
Yep.
"Hey, this is coming to me, and I understand that this is now part of the contractual obligation, but I would really like you to consider what we already do, which includes these 8 other things." And just trying to open up that conversation. More often than not, that is successful. So really, it's just making sure you're gonna be open enough to have the conversation and asking. And if not, then pushing back on, okay, well, the timeline that you laid out is unrealistic, so we are willing to do that, but it's going to be a longer time frame than you've laid out, because we've already got a pretty mature program, and this is how we manage that today. In the interim, this is what we'll provide you. So it's really just being willing to step into that negotiation that maybe you weren't originally part of.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think just having the courage to ask, because
Mhm.
the sales team, they're fielding a deal, they're going through the contract. Sometimes, SOC 2 or ISO or PC, whatever it might be, just lands in the contract, comes across the GRC team's table, and you're like, hold on a second, we're already doing these other 3 frameworks. Like, I understand the risk they're trying to get through here, but if I wonder if they'll just take that framework instead of the one they're asking about. And if you'll just pick up the call and like talk to the GRC team on the other end, often you can pretty easily get that concession. And it's like you said, Drew, it's pretty interesting how rare I actually see that conversation happening and people just
Mhm.
kind of doing it. So good piece of advice there. Second one I think is also good for you. This came up several times. A lot of people were asking about this. Is one of the challenges when it comes to multi-framework or really any audit is getting that very, very generic evidence request list. And sometimes it doesn't match the reality of the company's environment. So it can create some friction between the auditor and the folks being audited because they just don't know what in the world you're asking for. What do you recommend? Like, how do you keep that open dialogue with to start customizing that kind of stuff?
Yeah, I think the main thing on the auditee side of that is being willing to give the auditor as much information on the front end from a policy and control standpoint. Ask the auditor to spend time with that before they even formulate your request list, and then lay out the expectation that you have that it is going to be specific to your environment based on the information that you provided. It wouldn't surprise me if the auditor then says, "That's fine." I would at least like to have some interviews as well on the front end to make sure we do have a good understanding. And oftentimes you kind of see it, being laid out. A request list comes in and then interviews. And oftentimes an auditor hadn't even looked at the evidence. We try and lay out our timeline where we've reviewed the evidence before we even come in and have a discussion with our customer. So it's, "Hey, this is how I understand the process works. Can you tell me more about, or is this accurate?" As opposed to, "Tell me how this works." But a lot of times that's what auditors are coming in and asking on the front end. So maybe it's even adjusting the timeline and having the conversation first, and then just really laying out that expectation of, I want it to be harmonized across these frameworks. I want, one request, and they're people. So some of these things are going to be missed. Maybe there's onesie twosie things where they ask for the same piece of evidence across a couple different frameworks. But I would challenge your auditor to be doing those things. And if you do that, the auditor's probably going to work pretty hard to try and meet
It's
you
a
there.
partnership. I've seen the same thing. It's two reasonable people talking. And we're right at the top of the hour. So first, thank you everybody who joined and everybody who's able to watch this. I do want to point you back to two resources I think are really, really helpful. You've heard Drew's perspective and my perspective here. I've done this same type of webinar with some customers that were managing multiple frameworks, sometimes up to 5 and 6, and went through a whole year's journey of doing exactly what Drew and I are talking about. With CSG, we saved them like, I think it was $1.6 million. And then with Platform, I think they went from 1,300 controls to about 288. So like a 75% reduction, just really incredible results with both of those organizations. And it's not me talking, it's them talking about how they did it, the challenges internally. So if you're just looking for those talking points and hear someone else's journey, check those out. We'll link in the comments to that, and you can see the link here on the screen. So, Drew, thank you so much for joining and spreading some of your knowledge. And thank you, everybody else. And we'll talk to y'all soon.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Christian.